Those of us that speak both languages, Hindi and Punjabi, or at least pretend to speak both languages, generally get words confused because we don't see much of a difference in the two. And my kids who were born abroad, the first time they came to India with me, and they saw me speak Hindi, they looked at me and they said, "Wow, Dad, you speak this foreign language we've never heard." I thought, I missed something. Anyways, it's an honor, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's amazing to listen to the kind of inspirational people you have had on stage that have gone through adversity and persevered and are here to inspire us. My journey is sort of unique. It is sort of being part of when the dams break. Imagine when the dams break and you're in that water. And it's not a journey that I can say that I determine the direction of. It's a journey that I've decided not to drown in, but I'm surfing on those waves of that dam breaking. But it's a very sort of interesting kind of, I don't know if this is the right word, but revolution. And I'd like to share with you how it started in India, why I think it's important, and where it's going. In business school, they talk about jugaad. Jugaad's become this very interesting word that reflects how entrepreneurial kind of businesses get done in India, especially for the bottom of the pyramid. And I'm going to talk about frugal innovation, and I want to sort of differentiate that from jugaad. You know, when we think of jugaad in India, we think of something like this. Maybe if we can get the lights down. You know, here's a tractor on compacting drums, and we think of, you know, how the villagers get by with equipment that they need. To me, though, frugal innovation isn't about jugaad in that sense. It's about affordability. There's a significant portion of the population of this country, and the world for that matter, that doesn't have access to the same kinds of tools and opportunities that those of us that are in this room do. And I think that the only true barrier is affordability. And I'd like to talk about how to break that affordability barrier and the impact of breaking that affordability barrier. And specifically for the whole issue of education. If you're in this room already, you're not part of the real challenge. You're actually not my target customer. India, the statistics proudly tell you, has 220 million students, the largest body of students in the world. What they don't tell you as much is that grades 5 to 8, 43% of those students drop out. Grades 9 to 12, 68% of those students drop out. And if you extrapolate that, instead of 220 million, there should be 360 million kids in schools in India. And that's a huge, huge challenge. You know, for many years on the global stage, India has talked about the next century is ours. We've got the demographic advantage because the Chinese went through this one-child policy. The US and the European population is getting old. We've got this young population, and we're going to take over the world. Except I remember it's about a year ago, The Economist ran a front page story and called it the angry young Indian. And what they asked was that if you've got this demographic advantage, but you don't educate and develop the appropriate skills for that young demographic to be able to contribute to society, to be able to contribute to the economy of the country, then the impact of that, the negative impact of that, is very significant. I remember Manmohan Singh was asked during the Arab Spring in Egypt if he thought that something like the Arab Spring could happen in India. And he said, no, something like that couldn't happen ever in India. And that same summer, we saw the Anna Hazare and the anti-corruption campaigns happening at Jantar Mantar in Delhi. These are just the start of a revolution that's happening in India, and we've got to solve the challenge of education in India for this to be resolved. The difficulty with education in India is that the quality of education is in direct proportion to your economic class. If you can afford it, you can afford to be here. The majority of India can't afford it. If you're familiar with Sugata Mitra and his work, this is a chart from one of his studies. If you're not familiar with his work, I recommend on YouTube search for Indian teacher, search for black hole experiments or hole in the wall experiments, and you'll get a sense of the kind of work that he's been doing. He took a standard math test and gave it to kids around New Delhi. And then he took that test and gave it to kids 50 kilometers outside of New Delhi, then 100 kilometers, then 150 kilometers. And he started going further and further away from the large metropolitan city. And what he saw was that the same test that was producing marks in the range of 68% in and around New Delhi, by the time he got to 250 kilometers away from the closest large metropolitan city, the results were in the 15 to 20% range. What he showed was that good quality teachers migrate to the big cities. They don't get into where 70% of India lives, where 1 billion people live, that is rural India. The quality of life, life standards, security issues, pay scales, and so on mean that the best of the best end up in the big cities, and they don't end up where 1 billion people live. How do you solve that? How do you get a decent quality of education to that 1 billion Indians? I believe that the solution to that is internet access and computing. For kids that want to learn in that environment, internet access can be empowering in an amazing kind of way. It hit home to me a little while ago when I asked my son, I said, what's the most innovative thing you've seen your schools do? They've been experimenting with different kinds of education over the last few years, and what's the most innovative thing that you think that they're doing? And he thought for a little while and he said, I think that the most innovative thing they've figured out how to do to improve the quality of education is rewind and pause. I said, what do you mean? Rewind and pause? He said, well, what used to happen is that the teacher would get up there, would talk for 40 minutes, and then leave and give us a bunch of homework. And the kids that were really smart would get it, would comprehend it at a fast pace. And many of us that weren't able to comprehend it at the same pace, we just wouldn't get it. We'd take that homework back home. We'd ask an older sibling, a tutor, a parent, somebody else to help us answer those questions. And that's where the real learning would happen. What they've started doing in a number of classes now is that they give you the video lectures ahead of time so that you watch them before coming to class. And if you don't understand certain concepts, you can pause them and you can rewind them. And in class, they give us the homework they would have given us otherwise. So we sit there and we do the homework, and the areas we have difficulties with, the teacher comes around and helps us individually, puts us in groups of 4 or 5, and resolves issues that are common to a few of the students. The teacher isn't the lecturer anymore. The teacher now is the coach. This concept of the flipped classroom is starting to impact education in very interesting ways around the world. It empowers students and empowers teachers. The ability to access the internet empowers people in a very significant way, not only in education, in every other part of life that you can imagine. We saw it with the Arab Spring. Protesters were able to organize when and where to get together using Facebook. And they were able to overthrow a dictator that had been in power for 20 years. The power of the internet is is amazing. I see it every day in the work that we do. Think of the Malala Yousafzai story, if you're not familiar with her. She's this girl from the Swat Valley in Pakistan, and she got taken off a bus and shot in the head by the Taliban because she dared as a girl to go to school. This is the reality of the world that we live in, unfortunately. In that environment, where parents are afraid to send their kids to school, the internet can empower home-based education and solutions until security issues get resolved. Unfortunately, the difficulty is that access to internet is limited, and it's limited to the rich few. I remember a few months ago, maybe it was close to a year ago, front page news in India that India has now hit 100 million internet users and is the third largest internet country in the world. How exciting is that? Except, it's not a country of 100 million people, it's a country of 1.2 billion people. And when you look at the study further, it talked about 100 million active users, and active was somebody who accessed the internet once a month. Once a month is active. Those that were super active, that accessed the internet at least once a week, were only 48 million. Barely 4% of the population accesses the internet regularly in this country. And somebody like me that does it every 30 seconds, I have no idea if that's active and super active, which category I fall into. But out of 1.2 billion people, only 4% truly access the internet. And if I ask you, well, why do 900 million access mobile phones and only 4% access the internet? Why is it that mobile phones are more useful than the internet? And if I ask you, if you're stranded in a deserted island and you have the option of a cell phone or the internet, which option do you take? Maybe if I could do a show of hands and say, anybody here for cell phones versus the internet on a deserted island and you have no other access to anything else? Cell phones, anybody? Zero, right? You knew that the cell phones would be the wrong answer, right? Because then I would have just laid into you. Because the internet gives you everything else. You can go to YouTube and find what berries you can eat and not, and how to make the canoe to get off the island, and you can communicate and you can do lots of other things. The power of the internet is probably one of the most important things that humanity has ever done. It's the great equalizer. Except your economic class decides if you have access to it or not. And we believe that we can resolve that. We can resolve that by breaking the affordability barrier, and we think that we can empower better quality education through computing internet access. But it's not about computer labs. My biggest challenge, my fight with NGOs and other government entities and so on, where we do deployments, is to get them to realize that I actually want this to be the child's toy. I was at a conference one, and I was sitting with a few other competitors on a panel, and one of the competitors said, well, we don't make toys for kids, we make serious products. I got so excited. I said, I make toys for kids. That's what I want to do. I think it's way more powerful for it to be a toy that the kid takes home and not worry about breaking it or losing it, instead of computer lab that happens once or twice a week and then it gets locked up. And we see it everywhere. When it becomes the personal tool of the child, learning happens at a scale that's unimaginable. It happens 24/7. Try to understand why affordability is important. I tried to look at what happened in the US. At what point in the US did computing and internet access really take off? And that happened sometime in 98 and 99. And what happened in 98, 99 is we saw an interesting inflection point. And the inflection point was when the cost of the average computer dropped below 25% of salary, a week of salary. And we decided, we've got to figure out, can we create a computing internet device that's within a week of salary? in India, after you get past the first 100, 150 million people, for the remaining population, a week of salary means less than 2,500 rupees. And the idea was, can you create a reasonable product for 2,500 rupees? How do you do it? There are three elements to what we did. One was the hardware itself. The second one was the business model. And then, of course, there was some technology associated with it. The hardware wasn't just us. Google had a lot to do with it. Google created a democracy on hardware which has shaken the future of computing forever. When this process started a few years ago, the only microprocessor manufacturers that we'd ever heard of were Intel and AMD. Google decided to make microprocessing an open source solution. They did a deal with a company called ARM in England and said, we will use your platform for our Android operating system on the condition that you allow anybody to make chips based on that platform. And about 200 people, around 200 companies around the world decided to make chips for Android. But 50 of them have survived, but 50 is a lot more than 2. And the result of that is that pricing on CPUs has crashed. So the two things that the Windows Intel monopoly owned have gone away. The operating system is free. It's going to be free forever. And the cost of the CPU has dropped so much that it's a commodity. Christmas, and we were going to do an IPO in 2010, and our company was growing at a fantastic rate. And 3 months before the Christmas season started, the company that supplies us the LCDs and the touchscreens went bankrupt. They went bust. And this was a huge shock to our system because nobody else was willing to supply us touchscreens. We were too small. There were half a dozen players in the world. They were supplying Samsung, LG, Apple, and others. And we were just way too small for these players. So, as a couple of young Indian kids in Montreal, we decided, well, isme kya jadoo hai? And we decided to try to figure out, can touchscreens be made by ourselves? We lost Christmas 2009. It took us another 7-8 months. But the result is we created our own LCDs and touchscreens. So those things that today, on a 7-inch projective capacitive touchscreen, you can buy in a 1 million unit quantity from China at about $11, cost us $2.50 to make. It doesn't mean that we make it cheaper than the Chinese. All it means is that because we make it ourselves, we eliminate the margin in the middle. So there was a hardware component to doing this. There was also a business model component to trying to get the price down to where we wanted. We had to figure out how to separate the user and the payer. We realized that our customer is very, very price sensitive, and not all the revenue comes from the sale of the hardware. A significant portion of the revenue comes from hardware. But there's a lot of revenue that comes after the consumer has bought the product. Think of how much the iTunes App Store contributes to Apple. Very significant. Think of what the telecom companies pay Apple when you use the iPhone. So realize that it's not just hardware. If we can figure out how to make money from other elements, network services, that could be a large portion. Content and apps becomes a large portion. And then advertising becomes a large portion. Google today sits on as much cash as about 8 years of India's educational budget. 8 years. And they make that all off of advertising. They give you free search, they give us a free operating system, and they make it off of advertising. So realizing that 2/3 of our margins can come from those elements, we decided that we should shift the burden away from hardware, make less margin on hardware, and make it on the recurring revenue streams. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this convoluted kind of slide, but really what our vision is to deliver internet access, not just low-cost devices. The hardware is a customer acquisition tool to be able to give you free internet access and make money from the recurring residuals. Hopefully by the end of this month or sometime in March, we'll finally be able to launch free internet access on our entry-level devices. 4,000 rupee device comes with a SIM and free internet access. I wanted to talk about this concept of the disruption of the good enough. Along with some praise that we get, we of course get our very fair share of criticism. But this idea that the low-cost device is good enough, I think, is very important. One of the most influential books that I ever read was by a Harvard professor by the name of Clayton Christensen. He wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. If you've not read that book, as business students, I'd recommend that you do, and I'd recommend you read it at least once a year. And what he showed was this chart that you see up here, which has two blue lines, one that talks about the performance demanded in the high end of the market, and the bottom line that talks about the performance in the low end of the market. And what he shows is that the difference in the two goes away over time. If you look at the first iPad, it was a Cortex A8 1 gig processor and 256 megabytes of RAM. And maybe it was somewhere between the high end and the low end of the market. The first Akash was a 366 megahertz processor at 256 RAM, and roundly criticized by many that it didn't meet the expectations of the low end of the market. The second version, though, got up to a Cortex A8 1 gig processor and 512 RAM. Same level of processor as the iPad, double the RAM as the original iPad for 2,000 rupees. While it didn't compete with the current version of the iPad, my question was, is the user experience in the original iPad good enough for that young child in that rural village where the teacher shows up twice a month? This concept of good enough creates disruption in many markets, and we hope it'll create a disruption here. In fact, if you look at the next iPad, went up to a dual-core processor, 512 RAM, and the one after that went up to a dual-core processor and a gigabyte of RAM, and then the current version is a 1.3 gig dual-core and a gigabyte of RAM. Within the next few weeks, you'll start to see a bunch of publicity and hype in the media and other things about Akash 4. And that is a 1.5 gig dual-core processor and a gigabyte of RAM for about 2,500 rupees. You add duties and taxes and other things, it increases, but that's good enough to create a disruption within that market. The question is, will they buy it? And my time's almost up, so it'll take just a couple of minutes to finish up. Here's been our experience. In 2011, the Indian market was only 250,000 units, and nobody thought that the market for tablets would increase significantly. The disruption that got created increased that market to 3.1 million over a year, and we became the largest supplier of tablet computers, outselling Apple by a factor of 2. And in some quarters, we outsell Samsung. In some quarters, they outsell us. But an unknown player, 18 months ago, created a market where people said that the entry level of the market will never buy a tablet computer. They said, who's going to teach them? Who's going to teach the entry level of the market? Now outsells the largest companies in the world by just focusing on affordability. And it's contagious. This is a revolution that got started in India, and it is spreading at a level that is unimaginable, truly unimaginable. Turkey's decided to purchase 11.7 million tablets across a series of vendors to make sure that every child in Turkey is equipped with a product. The government of Thailand is doing the same thing. There are a total of 43 countries around the world that have made broad-scale announcements to make sure that every child in the country gets equipped with a device of this nature. India is moving a little slow, but at the same time, there's a vision to ensure that every child over the next 5 to 6 years has access to computing and internet. And that changes the scale of how computing gets done in a big way. We see it everywhere in the world. We see it in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, in Angola, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Senegal. We're doing it in Mexico, we're doing it in Nicaragua, we're doing it in Ecuador, and we're doing it in Haiti. We're doing it in the US, UK, and Canada. This is an Indian revolution that started with Indian focus on frugal innovation that's changing the world in such a way that's become a surreal kind of life. In fact, 3 days ago, MIT Tech Review announced their list of 50 most innovative companies in the world. And with Amazon and Samsung and Apple, we got included in that list. The current foreign minister of Sweden, who was the last prime minister of Sweden, tweeted that internet for the billions is coming. Forbes magazine called it world-changing. In fact, I thought Ban Ki-moon's words when he launched this at the UN were really encouraging. He called it the great enabler. Be proud of a frugal revolution started in India. Thank you so much.